Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Monday, April 7th, 2025. It's the year of AI. Everyone is telling us that AI is inevitable, although some people suggest that perhaps it isn't. One thing that's for sure, even I will say this, books about the AI revolution and the AI revolutionaries are inevitable. Last week, we did a show with Keech Hagee, the Wall Street Journal writer, who has an upcoming new book out on Sam Altman. It's called, appropriate enough, The Optimist. Lots of it deals with the rather poor relations with between Altman and Elon Musk, another co-founder of OpenAI. Musk, of course, now has XAI, which he's merged X into. And given this small avalanche of books about AI, tomorrow there's another new book out about one of the leading pioneers of the AI revolution. The book is called The Thinking Machine. Jensen Huang, Nvidia, and the world's most coveted Microchip. It's by Stephen Witt, a Los Angeles-based writer, and he's joining us today. Stephen, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Am I being unfair? Is there something inevitable about all these new books on the AI revolution, given it's changing our business environment?
No, I think it's completely fair. There certainly are quite a lot of books, but I think it's because we've had a real technological paradigm shift. This is real. AI is real, and it's going to transform almost every aspect of society in the years to come. And I think journalists and writers are just starting to understand that. Similar to the internet or the Industrial Revolution, this is going to have a tremendous impact on the economy, on our lives, on society. And so I think everybody's racing to write about it. You know, I mentioned to someone, yeah, I'm writing a book about AI. And then he said, well, I am too. And then we sort of looked at each other and we said, well, what else would we write about? So that's kind of where we are right now.
Publishers, Stephen, are a little nervous about AI. I think they get pitched a lot of the books. So your book must have had a good pitch. You've got a very good background. Your book, How Music Got Free, was a huge success. So you're familiar with the impact of the internet on our culture and our economy. Yeah. What led you to write this book, Stephen, on Nvidia?
Yeah, so I was using ChatGPT and similar systems for the first time in 2022 and was just amazed by their capabilities. And I started to investigate, what had happened. How was this possible? And obviously, as you have that book on Sam Altman, there was a lot going on with OpenAI. There was a lot going on with kind of other similar systems. But there wasn't really much talk about the hardware side of it. AI is a revolution in software. We're using a new kind of software called a neural net. But it's also equally a revolution in hardware. We're using a new kind of microchip, a new kind of circuit called a parallel computing circuit. So really, we've rebuilt the way the computer works, just from the very transistor, from the microchip up. Everything is going to be different the way it functions from now on. Now, that hardware side is less accessible to kind of the lay reader, right? Most readers can interface with ChatGPT very easily via their website or some portal, but they have no idea what's going on kind of in the guts of the machine. But I thought that was interesting to cover because it gave you kind of a behind the scenes view of the AI revolution.
Stephen, what's more interesting, Hong or Nvidia? The man has become, with his rather cute leather jacket, has become associated with the company. I want to get into what kind of fellow he is, but the company is quite remarkable. It has that internet startup quality, a web one quality. I know it was founded in a Denny's diner in East San Jose. They had $600 in cash to found the company. So it's quite a classic Silicon Valley miracle, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, they really were kind of working on the silicon side of Silicon Valley. So we tend to associate Silicon Valley now with these big software giants, these big internet giants, Google and Facebook and companies like that. But Nvidia built the hardware. They actually built the microchips, and these guys, the three of them, all had electrical engineering backgrounds. They saw an opportunity, at least initially, in the video game market to sell 3D graphics rendering software to sort of make the graphics kind of like render on the fly very quickly, and so to turn your PC into something like a Nintendo. And they founded this consumer hardware startup by meeting at a Denny's repeatedly. Now, the Denny's story is very funny because that Denny's was in a bad part of town. And while they would initially meet there, they sort of were all just gathering to watch Jensen kind of formulate a business plan for the company. One of the co-founders, Chris Malachowski, kind of got bored one day, and he wandered over to this plate glass window facing the street that the Denny's was on. And he realized there were bullet holes in the window. And what had happened is that all the cops were meeting in Denny's to kind of do their reports and fill out their paperwork. And then criminals were coming to the nearby overpass to take pot shots at the cops. So people were shooting at this restaurant that they were meeting in. And they hightailed it to another co-founder's condominium and signed the papers of incorporation there. But yeah, Nvidia founded in a Denny's and did video game hardware for the first 20 years. And
one of the things, Stephen, that perhaps you can help me understand is I would have assumed that Intel would have been as well positioned as any company to take advantage of this revolution. Of course, the foundation of Silicon Valley is a part of the Fairchild Semiconductor story. Many of the most brilliant people of Silicon Valley came out of Fairchild Semiconductor. So why weren't the big chip manufacturers of Silicon Valley, Intel and AMD, why weren't they the ones who built these chips that would power AI computers?
Great question. It's because they didn't see the market. And the reason they didn't see the market is that there was no market. So what Jensen did was something very unusual. He took his video game machines and he marketed them to the academy, to kind of research computer scientists. And he spent billions of dollars developing tools for research scientists, for computer scientists to use. Now, the problem with this is that the academic computing market is very small, at least it was at the time. It's only about $1 to $2 billion in total revenue each year. And so NVIDIA is spending as much on R&D as the entire market promises to return. Well, Intel and AMD looked at this and they thought NVIDIA was crazy. They thought they were totally foolish. Jensen has referred to this as the $0 billion market. And this was sort of his great insight, was to pursue kind of these marginal customers, these low margin customers, and lose money to do so for many years. His thinking being ultimately, if we're building world-class computer science tools for these academic research scientists, then somewhere downstream of that, profits must materialize. Somewhere way down the road, we'll have kind of a whole platform grow up around our system. But Intel and AMD couldn't make that conceptual leap. They just weren't willing to do it. And it was hard for Jensen, too. In fact, Jensen really angered his shareholders doing this. And for most of his career, for the first 20 years, NVIDIA did not have a particularly good reputation. They were viewed as an eccentric second-tier player. And so really this kind of takeover of the last decade was the result of this strategy. Ultimately, they did find the customers they were looking for. They found AI. But if you told Jensen or Intel or AMD that one day artificial intelligence would be a massive market for hardware, I think they all would have been very surprised. It wasn't really anything anyone saw coming.
Yeah, it goes against all the conventional wisdom of the startup world that you got to move fast and break things, and that you go from 0 to 100 billion in a few months. As you say, it was around for years. And I guess that Intel and AMD were prisoners in some ways of their own successes. This is the classic innovator's dilemma, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, in fact, I quote that book liberally in this book because Jensen was obsessed with the book The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, and he assigned it to all of his top executives.
Who, by the way,
But
has been on this show before. I don't think he's around anymore, but he's a
yes,
delightful
unfortunately,
Canadian
he
academic.
passed away a few years ago. But he's a great, really smart guy, and he deep insight into the way the world functions. Once you see the innovator's dilemma occurring, you start to see it anywhere. And what the innovator's dilemma is, it's not necessarily high tech. It's stuff actually that looks kind of like stupid and cheap, but rapidly innovates along new principles that established players ignore. So his classic example was the Honda motorcycle, which first entered the U.S. market in the 1960s. And they were selling, dirt bikes basically to teenagers. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys wrote a song about one. That was their only product in the United States. Now, the established players like GM looked at the dirt bike market, and they said, well, this is small and we don't make a lot of money here, so we'll just ignore it. Honda can have that market. We're perfectly ready, willing to give it to them. But this was an error because it allowed Honda room to move and to innovate and to grow and then to raid the U.S. automotive market from below. Jensen saw the same opportunity with this parallel computing stuff. It's a very similar thing. He was building kind of like equipment for video games, for gamers, and selling it for quite a lot of money. But Intel didn't want to participate in that world. AMD actually did participate in that world, but they didn't follow into the academic computing market, which just looked so small, so niche, so complicated, and just not worth pursuing at all. And that was Jensen's insight. It's the reason that he's now kind of like a business tycoon. He was willing to take this risk that no one else was willing to take.
Yeah, it's why he's worth more than $100 billion.
Yeah.
The figure at the foundation of the chip business in Silicon Valley was William Shockley, a notorious character with some very troubling political views and was a profoundly offensive figure. I mean, that's why Intel was eventually founded, because everybody left Shockley Labs. I'm guessing that Jensen is the opposite of Shockley. He doesn't seem to have any offensive qualities. He's certainly not Steve Jobs, is he?
He's certainly not Shockley, who held a variety of racist views. Certainly Jensen doesn't have that. And people didn't like Shockley. People love Jensen. The people who work for him, they love him. But he does have rough edges. I mean, he is a tough boss, and he will scream at his employees. He will yell at them. And one of the things that he does is when an employee makes a mistake or doesn't deliver a product on time, he will sort of make the head of the group or the employee stand up in front of an audience and kind of deliver a kind of self-critique of their performance. And then Jensen will deliver just a withering analysis of what they've done wrong in front of, 100, 200
Oh,
people.
the Cultural Revolution comes to Silicon Valley.
It is, I described it as a corporate struggle session. And it really is.
Although Jobs like that sort of thing too, and I think Bezos at Amazon also got up to those sorts of things.
Yeah, in fact, and these guys trade in many similar ideas. I mean, another thing Jensen does is, perhaps you've heard of Elon at the Doge department, sort of asking all the government employees to email him 5 things that they did.
Yeah.
Jensen does this. So Jensen does this in Nvidia. Every employee at Nvidia each week is required at the end of the week on Friday to send Jensen a brief email outlining the 5 things they worked on this week. And it's Jensen's way of keeping tabs of the organization.
How many people work for Nvidia now? It must be a lot.
A little more than 30,000.
So he gets 30,000 emails a week from.
Yeah, he gets 30,000 emails a week. He doesn't read them all, obviously, but he does sample from this correspondence, and he will read, the stuff the cafeteria worker is sending him. I mean, obviously, he'll pay attention to his top executives too, but he doesn't ever want to feel too far from the front lines. Jensen's great enemy is bureaucracy. And he really is afraid of bureaucratic structures and bureaucratic kind of like power centers forming within NVIDIA. He doesn't want that at all. And in fact, his management style is completely kind of like flat. He has, if you look at like Harvard Business School, they recommend maybe like 8 to 12 direct reports to the chief executive. That would be the ideal number. Jensen has more than 60. He's got 60 people directly answering to him. There's no second in command. There's like no second layer of management. It's just kind of like Jensen and then everyone else. And so commonly at NVIDIA, even junior employees will receive an email directly from the boss telling them what to do this week.
It doesn't make me, I have to admit, particularly bullish on Nvidia's long-term prospects because
You wonder how scalable this is.
yeah, I mean,
But
when he goes, I mean, Jobs had the miracle of having a cook around that
yeah,
most founders aren't lucky enough
look,
or
listen,
perhaps
Jensen's
smart enough to
e-staff,
provide successors to them.
Jensen's e-staff is incredible. I mean, they are world class. They are so many of Jensen's executives could be CEOs at other firms. I genuinely believe that. But the reality is they've probably made way more money just sticking with Jensen at Nvidia. So why bother? He's got an incredible executive staff.
What's his own? How much time did you spend with him for this book?
I did about 6 interviews with Jensen for this book. So I spent probably about 8 hours with him total. And some of more candid places. I spent some time behind the scenes with him when he was.
Do you have to send an email every week to him telling him what you've done over the last week?
I wish I had done so because I actually did quite a lot. It was the busiest period of my life. But no, I didn't have to, I had complete editorial independence for this project. So
what's his own personal narrative in two contexts? Firstly, does he acknowledge that he had some luck? I mean, certainly the stars lined up for him. And secondly, who are his tech or business heroes? Who is he trying to emulate? Jobs, Andy Grove at Intel?
Yeah, great question. So the first question, he got lucky. They were lucky AI came along because while they were pursuing the scientific market, AI was not on their radar. And in fact, they had no dedicated AI employees when the big breakthroughs came. And the guy who made the breakthrough, Jeffrey Hinton, could not get Nvidia to return his emails for a while. But ultimately,
and of course, Jeffrey Hinton won the Nobel Prize last year for physics. An ex-Google person who I guess stumbled on some of these secrets of AI.
I wouldn't say Hinton stumbled. He devoted his career to trying to make these breakthroughs. I mean, that was kind of all he'd ever done. But what he did stumble upon was how well NVIDIA's hardware turbocharged his research. And that came as a surprise to NVIDIA. Now, Jensen would say, sure, I got lucky. But you have to remember, I was trying to build the killer app for scientific computing. I dedicated 10 years and billions of dollars in research money to doing that. Did I know it would be AI specifically? No, I did not know that. Did I think that something was out there? Yes, I did. And I made that bet quite aggressively.
I'm sure you remember, I'm sure you know Sarah Lacey, the tech reporter. I used to work with her at TechCrunch. She has a book out about, or she had a book out about being lucky the first time, second not. And it sounds like he did have a lot of luck, although it requires somebody to take advantage of that luck. Not everyone who would have had Jensen's luck would have had his success.
I'll say this. Yeah, he got lucky. But if I go out to some sheltered cove in the ocean and throw a net into the sea every day for 10 years, every day, dawn till dusk, and then at the end of 10 years, I catch the biggest fish that anyone has ever seen, did I get lucky? Sure. But I also was there to get lucky. I also put in the work to be available to get lucky.
Who else benefited? Actually, before we get there, what about his heroes, Stephen?
So Jensen's hero, I would not say is Steve Jobs. Jensen's hero, I will tell you, I think his role model, or the person he most closely resembles, is the CEO of the TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, Morris Chang. Actually, Morris Chang was Jensen's close personal friend. And Morris turned this kind of derelict semiconductor manufacturing facility in Taiwan into the world's factory, the world's microchip factory. Even today, almost all advanced microchips are produced through TSMC. And Jensen learned a lot from Morris. In particular, he learned the value of taking care of his smallest customers. Jensen was attempting to get TSMC to return his phone calls when NVIDIA was a startup, and the salespeople brushed him off. They just didn't care about him because he was running a tiny company at that time with 30 people. And so Jensen wrote a letter, like a personal letter to Morris, and sent it to him. And then Morris responded and took on NVIDIA as a customer and grew them from being this rinky-dink startup in like a small Class C office space in Silicon Valley into the largest microchip firm in the world. And TSMC benefited massively from doing so. Well, that's what Jensen does. He goes to his small customers and he builds them tools that will turbocharge their productivity. And he will lose money at first to do so. just in the hopes that one day down the road, this small customer will grow into a bigger customer and a bigger customer as Jensen unlocks new functionality for them. And this is really what he did with AI. He took a market that just didn't exist at all. There was zero money for AI hardware. It was not a market. It was not something that existed. It was a $0 billion market, as Jensen calls it. And Jensen grew it into a $100 billion market just by kind of investing in it and by building tools that would turbocharge the capabilities of his customers.
It's interesting that you bring up the Taiwanese angle. It's very important in this narrative. We did a show a couple of years ago with Chris Miller. He's been on the show a few times. His book, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, was a huge success, bestseller, won all sorts of awards. How much is Jensen's Taiwanese background bound up in the broader context of Nvidia and Miller's notion of the chip war being the thing that will define power in the 21st century?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Jensen was born in Taiwan, grew up speaking Taiwanese, moved to the United States when he was 10, and then has lived here ever since. So he's lived in the United States for 52 years. And he actually moved away from Taiwan to Thailand when he was 5. So he has not much direct connection to the island of Taiwan and didn't go back very often until after Nvidia began its relationship with TSMC. But one question I've often asked myself is, well, okay, what if Jensen was just some white guy from Ohio? Would Nvidia have been able to sort of forge these connections with TSMC and kind of build themselves into this superpower? And I think not. I think Jensen's Taiwanese heritage does matter in this context. I think also Jensen brings certain Taiwanese cultural characteristics to the way that NVIDIA functions and the way that it works. So he's kind of a blend. I mean, he's very much an American guy, right? I mean, he's been here since he was 10. He speaks English fluently with no accent. He kind of talks and behaves like an American. I think if he went back to Taiwan, sure, he would pass and he might fit in a little bit. But I think ultimately Taiwan would be more of a culturally alien place to him than, say, California would. So he's more Californian than Taiwanese, I would say. But there's a certain part literally of that Taiwanese DNA, but also kind of that Taiwanese business DNA, manufacturing, dedication to craft, very long hours, hard work, and maybe sort of more of a regimented work culture. NVIDIA is not Google. They don't have a climbing wall in the facility. They don't have a ball pit, right? It's a serious place where people come to do work. Now, having said that, NVIDIA also has some of that maverick sensibility of Silicon Valley, that we are going to break things. We are going to build kind of innovative world-class products, and we're not going to follow the rules. So he managed to blend. I think part of NVIDIA's success is that he can blend those two cultures, sort of the more Taiwanese aspects of it with the more American aspects.
I know he did study for a while at Stanford. You brought up Google. Larry and Sergey, of course, are direct products of Stanford culture.
Yeah.
How does he compare with the Larry Pages and Sergey Brins of the world? They were very, very talented computer scientists. They could have become superstars in the academic world. Is Jensen, could he have been a superstar academic had he got his PhD?
Great question. I mean, I would assume so, but he was not very academically inclined in that way. I mean, yeah, he got a master's from Stanford, but he did it as basically night school while working. It took him 8 years to finish. Excuse me. So Jensen was always a corporate guy.
I hope he did all his work at that Denny's diner where they founded the company.
Jensen was always a worker more than an academic. Now, having said that, several of his VCs told me that he is a world-class computer scientist, but he's doing hardware. And when you're doing hardware, you really have to physically build things at scale. And that needs that business acumen. That needs that logistics and business acumen that academics often don't have. So I think in under almost any scenario, let's say NVIDIA had failed, as it nearly did many times, I think Jensen would still be working on the front lines of designing microchips. I think actually he'd be building and marketing innovative products at some other firm. And I think he'd be an acclaimed executive that people paid attention to with a lot of patents. So I think he'd be an inventor, but Jensen is at home in the business world. He is at home with the competitive pressures of making a profit and competing in, a kind of challenging open marketplace. That's where he's most comfortable. Nvidia was one of 70 companies that tried to launch a 3D graphics chip in the mid 1990s, and they were essentially the only survivor. It was like battle royale. They all fought to the death, and Jensen emerged victorious. And so I think this is where he's most comfortable.
Well, there's always a handful of companies. There were, I had an e-commerce startup in the 90s. The only real survivor of the 90s was Amazon. So it's always a winner-take-all economy. You mentioned VCs. The foundation of Google, of course, is famously associated with investments from companies like VC companies like Sequoia, who made a fortune from this. Which is the VC company in the Valley that most understood what Nvidia was doing and bet and had faith in it? And
in fact, it was Sequoia, along with Sutter Hill. So Jensen famously pitched Don Valentine, the founder of Sequoia, and by all accounts, he bombed. His first business pitch was not very good. But Jensen had previously been working at LSI Logic, which was kind of the Silicon Valley. Let's say it was the Google of its time, of the 1980s and 90s. And Wilf Corrigan, the CEO of LSI Logic, had even sort of promoted Jensen to the management track, and it looked like he was grooming him to be the next CEO. And Wilf endorsed Jensen. And that's what it needed to get Don Valentine sign off. He basically said to Jensen, that pitch was not very good. But Wilf says, I have to give you money. So here's a check. The VCs I talked to, they didn't really care about NVIDIA's business plan so much. They didn't even care so much about the products they were making. They just believed in Jensen. They just believed he was a world-class computer scientist and a driven individual who was likely to succeed. They were betting on him. And in fact, NVIDIA's first product flopped. It was returned at stores and the company very nearly went bankrupt. And Jensen had to execute an extraordinary pivot under a tight time crunch to keep the company alive. This experience actually really kind of like forged who he is. And it became one of the sayings at NVIDIA that we are always 30 days from going out of business. And several times they actually were 30 days from going out of business. But it's
and in that sense, perhaps I won't keep on bringing up Steve Jobs, but of course, Steve Jobs went through the experience of being fired at Apple. And the company almost going out of business. When he came back, it was essentially bankrupt and he rebuilt the company. So maybe having that near-death experience was actually healthy. I have to admit, Stephen, that whilst he sounds an interesting figure, I guess, in some ways, but he doesn't strike me. I mean, some of the stories I've read about him giving, the only thing I know about him, or the only thing I remember about him, is his leather jacket. There's a story about him being given a leather jacket by a robot. To what extent is it possible? I mean, you've written the book about him, but might he turn out to be the 21st century version of John Chambers at Cisco? I remember in the 90s, Cisco was the most valuable company in the first internet revolution. Chambers was ubiquitous. Now, most people have never heard of Chambers, and Cisco barely gets in the news at all. Is it possible that in 10 or 20 years, NVIDIA will become the Cisco of this first wave of the AI revolution? And indeed, Jensen will be the John Chambers of all this?
It's certainly possible. In fact, there's two paths. One is that Jensen becomes the John Chambers of this era. Exactly as you say, briefly at the top, but not really that well remembered. You asked about Jensen's heroes. A name that he brings up a lot is Thomas Edison.
Whoa.
Jensen says AI is building the new industrial revolution, and that his big microchip facilities, but essentially these data centers that run all his microchips, are the new AI factories. They're the factories of the 21st century, where data goes in and intelligence comes out. And that every kind of firm will need to feed their data into one of these factories to get the intelligence out. So this is how Jensen is positioning himself not to be the Cisco of the 21st century. He wants to be in the middle of all AI, a pass through all AI. And if he's successful at doing that, I think he can really kind of maintain his position in NVIDIA. He also wants to do this with robotics. He thinks robotics is a coming $1 trillion market, and he wants to grow and train the brains of the robots in the period to come. Time will tell if he's more like Chambers or more like Edison. To me, I see the Edisonian DNA in what he's doing. He's out there with 300 different laboratories, 300 different initiatives, not just AI, but robotics, weather forecasting, medicine, basically you name it. Nvidia has a cutting edge lab trying to develop that stuff. I don't think Cisco ever had anything quite like that. I think they were sort of more focused on the business hardware that they sold. To me, Jensen has proven himself already to be more of an innovator than John Chambers was. I think Jensen has accomplished things that John Chambers did not already. And I think even if Nvidia fails, okay, even if they flop going forward, even if this proves to be kind of a short-lived moment, which, by the way, they've already been at the top longer than Cisco ever was, which was really a product of the kind of dot-com inflated bubble. Nvidia is earning real money. This is not a bubble in that way. But let's say they don't stay on top forever. I think Jensen's contributions already have put him in a different category. Jensen's in the National Academy of Engineers. I think he's really reshaped how the computer functions from the circuits up. And if he were to lose his throne, if some competitor were to come and knock Nvidia off, they would still be doing the same things that he pioneered. So in this sense, to me, he's already way ahead of Cisco.
You already talked about the innovator's dilemma. Everyone who wins from the innovator's dilemma eventually loses as well. As Nvidia, I was going to say Cisco, as Nvidia sort of broadens itself into mainstream business, as you suggest, for the company to survive, it has to do that. It's going to have to compete against the real giants, the Googles, the Microsofts of the world. I also read a piece in the Register about the end of Moore's law. What are the biggest threats to Nvidia? Is it that they will get eaten by their own innovation, or that they will get eventually gobbled up by the giants of technology and business? And of course, we haven't even mentioned Chinese companies are also increasingly competitive in the global chip and AI market.
Well, let's think about it. First, you mentioned Microsoft and Google. Now, these are Nvidia's biggest customers. They buy all these microchips.
But they're also, aren't Google developing, Google developing its own chip?
Yeah, so Google has its TPU, which I think has less than 1% market share. So they tried, but they were ultimately unable to compete, at least in the first round, with Nvidia. And AMD has tried. Intel has now tried. No one has been able to make inroads into this market. Nvidia still controls it. So yes, there's a risk there that one of them develops something innovative, but Microsoft's DNA is not in building hardware. That's just not what they do. And when they've attempted to build hardware, they've usually flopped. Google has a little more success there, but they're not microchip designers, really. China is a much bigger threat to Jensen.
What about Apple before we get to China?
Apple has done it. Apple's got their own silicon, which surprised a lot of people, and it does work well. The M1, M2 chips are great. And it certainly wouldn't be surprising if Apple came out with some dedicated new AI microchip. The thing is, Nvidia is mostly a B2B company. They're mostly selling these microchips to cloud providers and not to consumers. And so they're kind of behind the scenes a little bit. I just don't see Apple steering in that direction. Never say never. But I don't see it as being their priority. Most of what Apple makes are consumer-facing products. That's really where their success has been. The threat is from China, for sure. I know that's number one on Jensen's threat radar, particularly because NVIDIA chips are banned for export to China. At least the most advanced chips are. And so this actually creates an opportunity for China to kind of thrive and build its own ecosystem without having to compete directly against NVIDIA's best products. Excuse me. But I think perhaps the biggest risk. Are you editing this? Sorry.
No, you're allowed to cough on the show, Stephen.
Sorry. But the biggest risk, I think, perhaps. Give me a second. The biggest risk is another Jensen, right? It's another startup, another hungry startup operating out of Denny's right now that will come and knock off Jensen, just as Jensen knocked off Intel. I can tell this is the thing that Jensen is actually the most paranoid about.
In the same way as Intel knocked off Shockley.
That's the nature of this industry. Andy Grove.
What about the end of Moore's law? Is that always delusional? Is it conceivable?
Oh no, it's real. No, it's real. Moore's law is dead. Basically, what happened here is every couple years, we were able to shrink the number of transistors on the microchip, and in this way, we sped the microchip up. But what happened was we hit the physical limits of the universe. We shrank the transistors so small that there was nowhere left to go. They were talking about 1 to 2 atoms in width. There's nowhere left to go. And when you shrink them this small, they actually start to compromise their electronic function. They begin to leak electricity. And Jensen and his team saw this coming. They said Moore's law is going to run up into the physical limits of the universe. They're not going to be able to pull this rabbit out of their hat anymore. And this was actually the impetus for them to invest so heavily in parallel computing in the mid-2000s. They saw the looming end of Moore's law.
So Nvidia is a post-Moore's law company. Is that fair?
Absolutely, 100%. They've sort of realized, we can't pack that many more components on the silicon. We have to do something else. And that's really what parallel computing is. It moves the level of innovation up from kind of the silicon layer up to kind of the numerics layer, or the code that pushes the electrons around in the metal. This is where NVIDIA has so many great insights and where they've developed so much fantastic software. What
about the threat or opportunity of quantum?
Yeah, quantum is not currently a threat to NVIDIA. So classical computing benefited from an extraordinary coincidence, which was that the hardware and the software were invented at the same time in the same year in the same facility at Bell Labs by 2 separate research groups. So you mentioned Shockley's group. They came up with a transistor, an electronic switch that can go back and forth.
And they won the Nobel Prize for that.
Yeah, and Claude Shannon came up with the kind of concept of the bits, zeros and ones. Well, those 2 things slot together perfectly. We invented the bits, the zeros and ones for the software, and we invented the switch for the hardware in the exact same time. Quantum computing has not been so lucky, okay? So it's not been so lucky. Our theoretical foundation is the qubit, which is a more kind of complex thing that can occupy intermediate states between 0 and 1. But no one has figured out how to implement this in hardware yet. And there's 10 or 11 different competing proposals in research groups, trying to do kind of electricity at cryogenic temperatures, or manipulate photons, particles of light, or steer atoms with lasers. And all of this is basically still in the science experiment phase. Jensen joked recently, he's like, I'm surprised there's even quantum computing stocks. And people were like, well, you didn't know quantum computing was a sector, but he's got a point. Those quantum computing companies don't make any money and they barely have any customers. They don't even have a real product.
Although all it takes, as you sort of suggested earlier, is a Jeff Hinton to come along and...
The Jeff Hinton has already come. I mean, they know how
but I'm saying Jeff Hinton did that for AI. All it requires is the equivalent of Jeff Hinton in quantum to...
Well, what you're really missing there is the Jensen. You need the Jensen of quantum computing. You need the guy who's going to build the physical systems that actually make this stuff work. My impression is that this is a bit off, 5 to 10 years off. I have written about quantum computing. I'm obsessed with quantum computing, but it is still a field that has perennially disappointed technologists and investors.
But we used to say that about AI. I mean, there'd been these AI winters and AI ice ages. So maybe that can be the subject of your next book. Stephen, you've been very generous with your time. 2 more quick questions.
Sure.
Last week, the US President, Donald Trump, announced Liberation Day, April 2 tariffs. How does Trump's tariff wars, is this good or bad for NVIDIA? Does this put them in a competitive advantage with other chip manufacturers?
In theory, it's bad. NVIDIA's stock went down when the tariffs were announced. NVIDIA has benefited massively from trade, right? From global trade with Taiwan. And this is a tax on trade. Trump thinks trade is bad. He doesn't like international trade. He wants to have everything happen in the US. And so TSMC's response has been to increase its investment in this gigantic microchip fabrication facility that they're building in Phoenix. It's actually the largest foreign direct investment in the history of the United States. And Jensen has gone along with this. Now, the problem is historically, Taiwanese engineers were just much better than American engineers. They just higher productivity and they worked hardware. The hardware side of computing has always been kind of conducted in East Asia, at least for the last 30 or 40 years. And now we're trying to reshore it, and we just don't know if Americans have the technical capability to make this work. I think what's happening here is I think that Elon Musk is whispering in Trump's ear. And I think this is me speculating, but I think what he's saying.
Well, he's certainly whispering. We don't know what he's whispering, but I
I
think there's
think
any
what he's
doubt about
saying
that.
is in 10 years, everything in the plant is going to be automated. It's all going to be robots. And when that happens, that labor differential, the cost of labor differential that historically Mexico or Taiwan has enjoyed over the United States will begin to disappear. Once you've got robots in the plant, it doesn't really matter if the workforce is more or less productive. We've eliminated the human from the equation. And once we do that, then the only thing that matters is if the plant is close to a viable source of electricity and if the plant is somewhere safe. And Phoenix has both of those qualities. So we think maybe in the future, tariffs won't matter so much because human labor won't matter so much. And that was always what drove globalization and international trade. So I think that's partly what's happening here.
Although I'm guessing, and I don't want, this is another subject, maybe another book, another conversation, the geopolitics of Taiwan and China and everything else that's happening in the world would also have a significant impact on Nvidia, wouldn't it?
Oh, for sure. I mean, Jensen, look, China has designs on Taiwan. That's not a secret. And Taiwan has sort of maintained safety for a long time, both by relying essentially implicitly on the US to defend them, but also by having these giant microchip manufacturing facilities in place in Taiwan. Because if China attacked them, they would probably be destroyed in the war. And this would set the entire global economy back years. I mean, it would cause a recession if this were to happen. If the plants leave Taiwan, if they move to Arizona, then suddenly that kind of disincentive to invade goes away and Taiwan becomes much more vulnerable. I was just in Taiwan, actually, marketing this book. The book has been successful in Taiwan, and they are very concerned.
Yeah, maybe Chris Miller's title is all too accurate. Chip War.
Yeah.
Finally, in a broad context, let's end where we began. You suggested that AI is going to change the world. Your last book, which won a series of prizes, I thought it was an excellent book, How Music Got Free, is about the impact of the internet on the creative industry. Is it conceivable that this book might have had the subtitle, How Intelligence Got Free? Is that ultimately going to be the historical achievement, maybe not so much achievement, consequence of the Nvidia AI revolution?
Well, I hope not, because if intelligence roams free unfettered, we might be at risk. This is something Geoffrey Hinton has worried about. What control are we going to maintain over these highly intelligent systems? Can we make sure that they serve our purposes and only our purposes? Already there's an arms race forming around military AI, both for kind of like autonomous drones, but also for kind of planning and strategy. The kind of doomsday science fiction scenarios that we've seen in movies like Terminator and war games, there's the very start of that is actually starting to happen. And we have to be very careful that we keep these systems under human control, that there's always a human in the loop willing to turn the machine off. And most importantly, the machine itself has no survival instinct. It has no ability or desire to stay alive, because if it does, that could be very dangerous for us. So I'm not sure where this goes. And in fact, I pressed Jensen on this point a great many times. He didn't like talking about this with me. And in fact, at one point he started yelling at me, just basically saying, this is a ridiculous thing that you're bringing up. Like, why do you keep bringing this up? But I'm not alone. I mean, look, Geoffrey Hinton is very worried.
Elon Musk. I mean, that's why he and Altman split originally over OpenAI.
Yeah. And also Ilya Sutskever, who really built ChatGPT and in fact was instrumental in Nvidia's success, because he helped to build the first AlexNet system that was kind of the Wright brothers moment for AI. He too is worried about it. The only solution is probably a technological one. Attempting to regulate AI is counterproductive, because it will just move to the areas where it's not regulated. And that's not what we want. It will give China an advantage, for example. And so I think we're attempting to build systems that have safety built in somehow, but no one has yet cracked that technological puzzle. I would say that is probably the leading open question for AI. That's sort of the leading technological frontier of our time.
Maybe your next book, Stephen Witt. Your new book is called The Thinking Machine, Jensen Huang, Nvidia, and the World's Most Coveted Microchip. It is out tomorrow. Congratulations on the book. I'm sure it's going to have the same success as your How Music Got Free book. Great to have you on the show, and love to get you back on as the AI revolution on the chip war hots up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew.